Aside from the obvious contradictions in Ellie's assertions, she herself was mixed, and so by implication were her children. Edna's retreat on frontal confrontation seemed to have been only tactical. More profoundly, she had evidently, in marrying Norman, taken the decision to cross the barrier of psychological denial and silence in her own family and accept wholeheartedly her colored, read black, heritage. In a memorable letter written to Norman in the heat of the tension with her mother, she declares, quote, "The colored, that is mixed race, can never die out. The colored race has to go on now. White people are going to be forced to accept them when they see them developing superior intellects with fine physiques. It is a race that is beginning. It has enormous possibilities and with a great tendency towards producing that indefinable person, the genius. I want to do my share towards improving and helping on a new race. We are both intelligent, and I have great hopes of what our children will be. I don't want him to be white. I want him to have your own beautiful brown skin, and I want him to grow up proud of his race," unquote. It is this quantum shift towards a new perception of how to define herself that would provide a central tension in the rest of Edna Manley's highly creative career. Phenotypically white, and with a mother who had hidden any connection to blackness, Edna had in her self-perception become black. In her wider family, this tension was never resolved, and when years later in a London interview, she let slip the fact of her colored heritage, it led to splits, some irrevocable, within her family. But for her, this moment had been a crossing of the Rubicon, which eventually led to the island of Jamaica, and a commitment to its people that permeates her work from Beat Seller through Eve to Dawn and beyond. Edna and Norman were married in June of 1921. Just short of a year later, their first son Douglas was born in London, and 11 weeks later, infant in tow, they were on the banana boat Cometa headed for Jamaica. Confronting the question of race is something that Edna had done, as we have suggested, before leaving England. However, Jamaica, with its sharp class differences, persistent though somewhat differently constructed barriers of color and race, along with a stifling parochialism, presented new challenges. Her attempts to negotiate these new hurdles together constitute the second tension which determines her approach to her new home and comes for the remainder of her life to permeate her work. Jamaica in 1922, even with her sister-in-law Vera's assertion that it would be a better place for them to raise children, retained the unforgiving and unreconstructed color hierarchies of the plantation. Writing with reference to his mother's marriage to Thomas Manley, that's Margaret and Thomas, at a somewhat earlier period, Norman noted that when the very fair Margaret married, quote, "a near black man," unquote, she was isolated, as nearly all of her friends deserted her. Edna, for her part, faced multiple hostilities. She was visibly white and married to a dark brown man, which put her in almost the space Margaret had occupied with Thomas. But more peculiarly, she was a young artist coming out of the school of up-and-coming young sculptors in the active and hectic London scene. In Jamaica, not only was there very little art, but that which existed was oriented more to the decorative than the critical, inquisitive, and avant-garde. And persons, particularly foreigners not engaged in the traditional professions or in business, much more in the full-time occupation of sculpting, were looked on with suspicion. The social scene too was barren, and Edna could not stomach the Jamaican habit of relegating the women to one room, while the men gathered to drink and smoke and discuss business and politics in another. Has it ended? Moreover, the couple was poor, and there was a child to raise and support without at first any domestic help. Arriving in the island with £50 sterling, it would be many years before Norman's success as a barrister would make them relatively comfortable. And then there was the oppressive heat of the Jamaican summer, which triggered her first exodus to Mandeville, where there was some relief from the humidity, but not from the constraints of the society, leading to her second exit, home with her son to England in October 1923, with no immediate indication of of returning. Indeed, her return the following year, no doubt missing Norman, with whom she remained deeply in love, was only triggered after his purchase of a rundown house on extensive lands near Four Roads in St. Andrew, what would become the famous Drumblier residence. I mentioned the sequence to suggest that there was a restlessness surrounding Edna's engagement with Jamaica, in which she never quite came to terms with its social hierarchies. Norman provided her with a nest, Drumblier, and later Namdini in the Blue Mountains, in which she could raise a family and engage in her profession of drawing and sculpting. But her engagement with the society was always tentative, critical, and partial. She was in the society as Barrister Manley's and much later Premier Manley's wife and companion, but she was never of the society in the sense of fully imbibing and accepting its middle-class structures, norms, and aspirations. This 1985 remark, jumping forwards in time of course, in her diaries, made, albeit at a different time of severe economic hardship, and following Michael's stinging defeat in 1980, is nonetheless typical of the distances she chose to take, as much as the empathies she sought to adopt. I quote, "We wail about the cost of living that goes up and up. The well-off people can still afford to live, so they grumble, but they buy. Most of the middle class still cling on to living beyond their means. They don't really give up any of their comforts, but they do more than wail, they protest loudly. But it is the children of the poor in rural areas who leave for school in the mornings with a cup of tea with no milk and a little sugar to make it palatable. There's a whole age group who are going to grow up second-class citizens because they are so underfed. They won't have the health and the stamina to be anything else," unquote. At the same time as the white wife of Barrister Manley, there were the inevitable barriers that existed between her and the majority of black Jamaican urban and rural people. As Wayne Brown describes an experience from the first brief sojourn in Mandeville, quote, "Leaving Douglas with the nurse in the shade, she wandered down to the marketplace to sit on a wall and sketch. She could hardly have escaped altogether, although she later asserted this. The resentment of the peasants against her, for as a contemporary English visitor bitterly put it, for the crime of being white," unquote. I suggest then that the two critical tensions which inhabited Edna's work, distinct though connected to each other, was first, the tension inherent in her decision to embrace her black heritage, and second, the tensions arising from the insider-outsider contradictions in which her growing love for her new country, indeed her mother's country, struggled with her sharp distaste for its sclerotic structures and normative social constructs and cultures. I want to move now to 5 central themes in her politics. If we start with these 2 underlying tensions related to her encounter with Norman and her subsequent marriage and emigration to Jamaica, and connect these to the formative features that we have previously sketched as critical in her philosophical formation, then we can suggest 5 distinct political themes deriving from them that are consistent throughout the rest of her life in Jamaica. First, there is a sympathetic and laudatory appraisal and validation of black people, of poor people, and of democratic majorities. I'll return to this in the final part of my talk as we look more carefully at some of her work. Second, there's a nationalism that runs through much of her work. In other words, a positive sense of the possibilities inherent in the ability of the majority of black people to achieve what they will. This heartfelt outburst 2 months after the 1983 Grenada invasion expresses that sentiment as much as it does her despair at that particular low point of Caribbean sovereign expression. I quote, "I am old and going out. If I can just make it quickly, as I can't call to the youth of Jamaica to give Jamaica a chance, to give it support, leadership, imagination. To hell with America and Russia too. Why can't we give our own leadership?" Unquote. Third, there is a certain spiritualism, though tinged with agnosticism, perhaps best understood from an appreciation of her Blakean influences, which pervades her diaries and indeed her drawings and sculpture. She retained a healthy respect for science, symbols, and the afterlife, and certainly for biblical scripture, while retaining a distinctly anti-establishmentarianism towards the formal church. Fourth, There's a strong social reformist current through much of her work. Edna Manley was undoubtedly socialist, but Fabian moderation was never far from the surface. Thus, she was instinctively hostile to Soviet communism, as she was to some of the more precipitate actions of the local left, whether within the PNP or outside of it. Fifth, closely linked to the fourth point is a spirit of compromise, perhaps the most important legacy of her politics, which pervades her entire life and which is captured most poignantly at the time of Bustamante's death in 1977. I want to spend a little time on this because it is difficult to capture it in her art, yet it is so important in understanding the nature of her persona and of her philosophy. Bustamante, of course, had been the bane of Norman's political life. A founding member of the People's National Party, he had left it to form his own Jamaica Labour Party when he realized that he no longer needed Manley and the PNP to win elections. A supporter, if tepid, of federation, he abandoned the idea when he realized that significant local support had shifted for various and differing reasons against the idea and advocated instead single island independence. The supreme irony is that Manley, who had undoubtedly led the movement against colonialism, was shunted aside by popular mandate, and Bustamante, who had initially been against the idea of independence, became the country's first prime minister. Norman and indeed Edna had every reason to disdain Bustamante. Yet, when Edna heard what she considered as the poor way in which the pro-government media, her son Michael was then in power, and I must admit that I was a member of that media. I didn't write the release song. Had heralded the news of his death, she was livid with anger, and in her diary gave Bustamante what she thought was his due. Quote, "He did Norman and Jamaica many things which I never forgave. He never saw a new image that was waiting to be born. One couldn't hold him responsible for that. He had never seen it in those terms. But all his life he did look out for the cause of the poor and needy, and in his own vain, arrogant way, he was kind." Unquote. I don't think that's backhanded, but we can talk about it. Exploring Edna's work. In the final part of my talk, I want to undertake with some trepidation, particularly as a social and political theorist, treading in the den, as it were, of the guardians of aesthetic representation here at the Edna Manley School. A brief reading of some of her work through the lens of our prior three-part discussion of her formation, the two critical and dynamic tensions, and the 5 central themes I've tried to identify in her politics. Boy with Reed, 1928. 6 years into her Jamaican sojourn, Manley was already deeply engaged with the African-Jamaican form. Boy with Reed both valorizes and romanticizes while working within and beyond the post-war Western European modernist traditions. If the earlier and more successful Eve, with her African body but more European facial features, is representative of a transitional phase, then Boy with Reed is clear evidence of her commitment to a new aesthetic. Adam and Eve, 1930. In appreciating Adam and Eve, we need to remind ourselves of the context. There is at this moment no tradition of portraying black people in comfortable intimacy. There is further no tradition of portraying biblical characters as black, more so the two original human beings of the Old Testament as black. The portrayal itself, in the tenderness of Adam's grasp and the tentativeness of Eve's reaching out to him, leans to equality more than subordination, and is thus revolutionary on more than one level. Claiming the Bible for black people, proclaiming the naturalness of black love, and asserting gender equality. What could be more revolutionary? Negro Rose, 1935. Much has been written about Negro Rose as prophecy of the rebellion to come in 3 years, as proclamation of black pride, and as an awakening. I want to suggest that the heavenly gaze is certainly not one of awe and fear of a transcendent power, but rather the fixation and the vision of a new Jerusalem. The hands, out of proportion to the rest of the torso, are the oversized hands of labor and fount of all creativity. It is through the hands of black labor that the New Jerusalem will be realized. But is there not also in the silhouette of the statue, from base to head, the rugged contours of the Blue Mountains, and an implicit statement about the nation and its sheer physical splendor, alongside chants of national liberation and salvation echoing in the peaks and valleys? Diggers, 1936. The theme of labor is made more explicit and collectivized in Diggers. Remember, this is 2 years before the labor rebellion of 1938. Yet here is Manley valorizing the inherent dignity in work with an almost Stakhanovite intensity. Critically, though with little surprise, the laborers are unmistakably African Jamaican. 1936. Lest I be accused of androcentrism, Market Woman again captures the theme of the dignity of work, but this time with unmistakably Jamaican higglers. Hands akimbo, headed to the market, independent, willing to bargain for a fair price, but willing equally to kiss teeth and walk away from the customer if a ridiculous offer is proposed. Youth, 1938. This is a female version of Boy with a Reed, as it also captures the feistiness, parentheses, feistiness, explicit in Market Woman. However, I suggest it goes well beyond both in offering a profound statement of the power of Jamaican womanhood. This, and remember, it appears in the year of the labor rebellion, is a prophetic assertion of the latent possibilities in Jamaican women, which almost 80 years later is evident in the global statistics, where Jamaica, in its percentage of women managers, is at the head of the list of all countries. 7. Strike, 1938. Is for me Edna Manley's single most intriguing sculpture. Like Wayne Brown, I'm fascinated by the utilization of the image of a young man, purportedly PNP co-founder O.T. Fairclough, observing one of the strikes of 1938, to counterintuitively symbolize the typically kinetic notion of a strike. Instead of picket lines, placards, and all of the expected paraphernalia, we have instead a contemplative young black man, his hands stroking his chin in typical meditation style. Yet, if one were to imagine 1938 as a moment of intellectual awakening, as blinders being opened up on centuries of darkness, then the urgency of thought to reflect on what has been hidden and obscured, and more critically on what needs to be imagined and invented, is far more poignant than the mere representation of individuals or masses in action. Brother Man, 1961. Again, context is essential. Rastas were in the 50s the often feared rebellious element in the black underclass, barely understood, and certainly before the Smith, Oshie, and Nettleford Rastafari report, barely studied. This bust appears in the year after the Henry Rebellion, when Rastafarian leader Claudius Henry's son led a brief and abortive guerrilla insurgency against the still colonial Jamaican state, somewhat ironically with Norman Manley at the time as its premier. 3 years later, and post-independence, with Buster Manty in charge, the notorious Coral Gardens events would lead to the death of a number of policemen and Rastafarians, followed by an arbitrary reign of terror and roundup of Rastafarians in the community surrounding Montego Bay. Brother Man is a remarkable assertion of the dignity of Rastafari and a statement of respect, coming, we should recall, from the wife of the premier and soon to be leader of the opposition. It should also be compared with The Voice, 1980. By 1980, Jamaica is in the turmoil of the long, bloody election campaign. But on the other hand, Rastafari has come into its own. Bob Marley and the Wailers have broken into the world arena, and as Max Romeo sang somewhat earlier, everybody join Rasta bandwagon. But Edna was there before the bandwagon and managed in both her 1960 piece and this one 20 years later to capture the stillness, dignity, and dreadness in her iconic images of the Rastaman. Finally, Ghetto Mother, 1981. Rachel Manley describes Ghetto Mother as, quote, a culture and its people protecting itself and its ground, unquote. And she's right. Ghetto Mother, conceived in the cauldron of 1980 when violence was rife and everyone feared for their lives, is also a profoundly nationalist statement of a small country confronted by unimaginable military and economic power. The fright on the faces of the children is not only invoked through the close proximity of the offstage gunman, but by the entire uncertainty of these unknowable times. There may, however, be some solace in the sheer courage and power of defiant Jamaican motherhood. I conclude with the reminder that I've called my lecture a preliminary assessment, and indeed it is a work in progress, only scratching the surface of a rich vein that requires far more investigation. In the balance, there are many unanswered questions. How did Edna's own inherited melting pot of Wesleyan, Blakean, anarcho-spiritual Fabianism change over time? To what extent was Edna in turn influenced by Norman's own evolving philosophy as he rooted himself in his native land? Undoubtedly she was, but what in turn was her influence on him, and how did the two interact over the course of a lifetime? And what was the impact of this unique blend on the early PNP and the philosophical course of the national movement? And what profound impact did Edna have on her two sons, Douglas, the elder, and Michael, the younger, in particular, Michael of the politics of change, of democratic socialism, and most pointedly, of struggle in the periphery, certainly his most politically combative work? None of these closing questions are, of course, answered, yet they suggest the profound gap, as raised in my opening remarks, on the role Edna Manley has played beyond her enormous artistic contribution to the political formation of modern Jamaica. I end with a brief quote from her diaries, which reflects, if nothing else, her dauntless spirit and, despite the tensions and contradictions that I have suggested, always persisted, her commitment to the island home of her choice and her mother's birthplace. It is the morning after the bitterly fought 1980 elections. Her husband Norman has been dead for some 11 years, and her son Michael's party has been ignominiously defeated, losing the elections 9 seats to 51. So-called deliverance has come. But for Edna, it is a deeply saddening, but not unrecognizable moment of reflection, but also of recommitment, and I end with her words, quote, "Another day. Last night, I was a little bitter, but today that has gone. We have to blame ourselves as well. It's no moment for a post-mortem. It's enough to meet a new day. We fought a heroic election. And now what of the future? Where from here? Many will go away, but many will stay and life goes on. I think I will stay." Thank you.